Hi, all. I miss you, and I'm sorry I'm not in again. Hopefully, I'll be back next week. I wanted to record this part of the lecture because this is the part that I think is actually the most important as we're learning about historical thinking skills. So let's put this into full screen. I decided not to use my camera today because I'm still, it'll look amazing. So historical thinking skills, what are they? Well, they're a set of skills used by historians to analyze sources. We're talking primary sources, secondary sources, and the reason they use them is so they can have a better understanding of what happened in the past. And you, as mini historians, I think I'm kind of a mini historian. Anyway, if you as mini historians need to also learn these skills. So beyond the fact that historians use them and this is a history class, they also allow us to up our game a little, meaning they allow us to think critically, really looking at multiple perspectives and determining what is both true and or reliable. And we know those words can sometimes be a little bit challenging. And if we think back to that CCAP test, I know that we did in the fall, we did some of those historical thinking skills, but we apply them to modern day documents. We're doing something similar, but with historical documents. So, what are primary sources? You probably know this from middle school, but I think it's important to do a quick review on them. Primary sources are written or created, and listen carefully to this because Ms. Glickman said there was some confusion about this yesterday. They are written or created by somebody who experienced or was connected to the historical event. They were there. They saw it with their own eyes. They experienced it. Okay? That could be somebody who was experiencing Leningrad as if they were a person living there. It could be a journalist who was covering Leningrad at the time. That is what a primary source is. It's produced in the same time period as the historical event. Maybe it's not immediately, but it's within the same time period. So, of course, Anne Frank's diary is always a good example of a primary source. But a newspaper clipping is a primary source, a letter, an interview with someone who lived through that time period is a primary source. A photograph. The interview is an interesting one because the person is a primary source if they lived through it, even if the interview happens after the fact. Hopefully that makes sense. Secondary sources. These are people that use primary sources to describe a historical event. They may have been alive at the same time as Leningrad, but they didn't see it, they didn't experience it. Okay? Even though they wrote it during the same time, doesn't mean that they saw it with their own eyes. You could have lived during World War II and written about Leningrad from the United States. Would not be a primary source. It would be secondary. That person in the United States is using information that they found from people who lived through Leningrad, through people who wrote newspaper articles, etc. We also know secondary sources can be written at any point. People are writing about Leningrad 70 years later. So historical books, articles that are published later, an essay, so on and so forth. So, what skills do we need to use in order to examine these primary and secondary sources? There are four of them, and that's what you're going to practice today and next week. Number one is sourcing. That's to me, that's what you do right away. This is where you locate and predict important information about the source. Who's the author? When did they write it? What do we think their purpose is? And usually we can anticipate the purpose from the context, but not always. What is their perspective? Similarly, we can infer that from the context, but might be easier um, to do that after we've read it. And then we determine, can we trust this source? Contextualization. So this is an interesting one. Contextualization is just a fancy way of saying background knowledge. What knowledge do we already have that allows us to understand this source? What do we already know about Leningrad from going through the slides that's going to help you better understand the documents? We know that the situation was so dire in Leningrad that people had to resort to cannibalism. We know that Stalin, instead of helping his people in Leningrad out, he was using the airplanes that could have dropped food on Leningrad and using those for the war effort. Leningrad was almost forgotten about, and the situation was awful. So anyway, we use that background information to understand what the source is saying. What else do we need? Close reading. We need to look specifically at the language that the author is using. Are they trying to inform us? Are they trying to persuade us? Are they making specific claims? Are they backing it up with evidence? And lastly, corroboration. We remember corroboration from the CCAP test. It was the second C. This is where we compare sources to see how different perspectives agree or disagree. Even within primary sources, they could have different stories. Okay. I don't know if you remember, but last year when we looked at South Africa, we looked at multiple interpretations of the Soweto attack. Soweto was when um, government officials and police officers opened fire on unarmed children protesting outside their schools. One source said the police started it, the other source said the students started it. So there's always going to be, or there sometimes is going to be some disagreement. There might even be some different disagreement between primary and secondary sources as more information has come out. However, when sources tend to agree with one another, it does help with their reliability. We know the more sources that say the same thing, the more likely we can to trust it. Okay, I'm going to switch gears now and go to the Leningrad instructions. I am hoping that I'll be able to switch screens. You know what? I'm gonna pause this and I'm gonna switch screens in a second. Okay, so give me 1 second to switch, and then I'll explain how to do that.